All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about something I think we all struggle with, sometimes overthinking.
Yeah.
And to help us with this, we're going to be looking at an excerpt from The Spizz by Twisty titled How to Stop Overthinking Before It Stops You.
Okay.
Now, what's really interesting about this piece is that Twisty actually uses their experience winning a Super Bowl bet
Oh, wow.
to illustrate their points about overthinking.
Interesting.
So hopefully by the end of this, we can all learn some really actionable strategies
Okay.
to break free from that overthinking cycle and finally start taking action towards our goals.
I love that. I love that. Actionable steps.
Yeah.
That's what we want.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I mean, what do you think about using that analogy? Like winning a Super Bowl bet to talk about overthinking?
It's cool. It's cool. It's kind of interesting, right? Because usually when you think about overthinking, you're thinking about, kind of like anxiety and not taking risks.
Mm-hmm.
But this concept of a Super Bowl bet, you're kind of, there's a little bit of risk involved, but also excitement.
Right. Because you have skin in the game.
Exactly.
So to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you're kind of leaning into that, which I think is an interesting analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like it.
So, I mean, let's get into what they actually did. So Twisty, during the Super Bowl, won $1,350 on a $50 bet.
Okay. Wow.
But they also lost 7 other bets.
Oh, so
Yeah.
it's like they weren't perfect
Yeah.
at making these bets?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, but they still ended up, I think it was $830 ahead.
Well, wow. So they still came out, positive.
Right. Yeah.
On top. Okay.
And I think that's kind of what they're getting at is it's okay
Yeah.
to not win every single time or make the perfect decision
Mhm.
as long as you end up ahead in the long run.
Yeah, and that's such an important point to make because, and a lot of times it comes down to our perspective, right?
Mm.
If we're so focused on all the losses we had or all the mistakes we made,
Right.
it's hard to see the big picture.
Yeah.
And in this case, they may have had 7 losses, but they still came out $800 ahead. So.
Right. Yeah, and I think they were saying something about people focusing on the losses more than the wins
Yeah.
in general.
I mean, that totally makes sense, right? I don't know if you've heard of loss aversion.
Yeah.
It's this concept in behavioral economics where we tend to feel the pain of a loss
Mm-hmm.
much more strongly
Right.
than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
Yeah.
So that's why, when you lose $100, it feels way worse
Right.
than the feeling you get when you win $100.
Exactly.
So, Twisty kind of flipped that on its head
Yeah.
by focusing on that overall win.
Right. So instead of trying to avoid every single loss,
Yeah.
it's about kind of taking that chance, knowing that you're probably going to have some losses along the way, but that you could still come out ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. Shift that perspective from just avoiding failure
Right.
to embracing the possibility of success,
Yeah.
even if it comes with a few bumps.
Yeah. And this kind of leads into their first point,
Okay.
which is that the decision itself isn't as important as what you do after making the decision.
Okay.
So they use the example of a career change, if you're considering switching careers. But I think this could apply to anything, right? Any big decision you're trying to make.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. How many times have you found yourself stuck in that analysis paralysis?
Oh, yeah.
Where you're just oh my gosh, there are so many options, so many potential outcomes.
Yeah.
And you just get so bogged down in overanalyzing every little thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think this point is instead of focusing on the decision itself, focus on the steps
Right.
that you can take after that decision is made.
Right. Taking action can actually help break us out of that overthinking loop. Yeah.
It's almost like our brains are wired to solve problems. So if we take a step, it's like we're giving our brain a problem to work on.
That's a really good way to put it.
Instead of getting stuck in the what if loop.
Exactly. Yeah. It's that endless cycle of what ifs, what if this happens, what if that happens. We never really move forward.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a fantastic insight.
Yeah.
Kind of brings us to another point that Twisty highlights the importance of adaptability.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
They have this great quote in there by Mike Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this speaks to the fact that no matter how much we plan, unexpected things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Life is unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to be able to roll with the punches.
Right.
And I think that's especially true in this context of making decisions, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to adapt to the circumstances. Right. And I can imagine that Twisty probably experienced that firsthand with their Super Bowl bets.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, they probably had some strategy going in,
Mm-hmm.
but then those 7 losses probably forced them to, rethink their approach.
Totally. And I think what's really cool about this concept of adaptability is how it connects to, how our brains learn and evolve.
Oh, okay.
Right? Like, every time we encounter a challenge or make a mistake, our brain is actually creating new neural pathways, which strengthens its capacity to handle similar situations in the future.
So it's not just about, rolling with the punches. It's actually about training our brains to,
Yes.
be more resilient and resourceful.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's like building that mental muscle,
Yeah. So we can be ready for the next punch.
Exactly. Exactly. And this idea of adaptability kind of ties back to this point that Twisty makes about most decisions not being permanent.
Okay.
Right. Like, they give examples like hiring and firing, marketing campaigns, even learning new techniques. And it's this idea that, even if we make what we perceive as a wrong decision, we always have the power to course correct. Right.
Right. So it's not the end of the world.
Exactly. We have the ability to adjust
Yeah.
our approach as needed.
Right. And that is reassuring because I think a lot of us get caught up in that fear of making a mistake that we can't come back from.
Oh, absolutely. And that fear can be so paralyzing. But what Twisty is suggesting is that we shift our focus. Instead of trying to avoid mistakes altogether,
Right.
we view them as valuable feedback.
Yeah.
It helps us learn and grow. It's almost like we're constantly collecting data points, even from those missteps, to make more informed decisions in the future.
Yeah.
So instead of viewing those as failures, we can see them as opportunities to learn and adjust.
Right. It's like, okay, well, that didn't work, so what can we do differently next time?
Exactly. And that brings us to this, final point that Twisty makes. The world belongs to those who move.
Okay.
It's this idea that even if you don't have all the answers, even if you haven't perfected your plan,
Right.
the act of taking action itself gives you a significant advantage.
Okay, so it's not about being perfect, it's about just getting started.
Exactly, yeah. And I think about it this way. Every time you take action, you're essentially running an experiment. You're testing your hypotheses, gathering data, and then refining your approach based on the results.
Right.
So even if the outcome isn't what you expected, you've still gained valuable insights.
Yeah. It's like every time you do something, you learn something.
Exactly. And that's what I think sets those who take action apart from those who get stuck in overthinking. It's not necessarily about having more knowledge or skill. It's about having the courage to try things out,
Yeah.
to experiment.
Yeah. And this is where that Super Bowl analogy comes back in, right?
Yes. It wasn't about winning every single bet.
Right.
It was about having the courage to place those bets, to learn from the outcomes, and ultimately come out ahead in the long run.
Yeah. So it's about taking that chance, knowing that you might not win every time, but that you could still learn and grow from the experience.
Exactly. And I think that highlights something really crucial about the relationship between action and learning.
Okay.
By taking action, we create those opportunities for feedback and growth. We figure out what works, what doesn't, and then we adjust our approach.
Right. So it's like we're constantly iterating and improving.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about. It's not about being perfect. It's about being a work in progress.
Right.
Always learning and refining.
So it's not about having everything figured out from the start. It's about embracing the journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a much more empowering and sustainable way to approach decision making.
Yeah. It takes the pressure off.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that brings us to the heart of Twisty's message, which is that action is really the key to unlocking our potential,
Right.
and breaking free from these self-imposed limitations of overthinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's been a really insightful conversation so far. We've kind of explored the psychology and a little bit of the neuroscience behind overthinking, the power of action and adaptability, and then also this really important idea of reframing mistakes as valuable learning opportunities.
Right, because they're not failures, they're just feedback.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think we've only just scratched the surface of this conversation.
Right.
So in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to delve into Twisty's specific recommendations
Okay.
for those bets that we can make in our own lives.
Awesome.
Yeah, and we'll explore how to like translate those insights into practical strategies for taking action.
Yeah. So stay tuned, listeners, because we're about to unpack some actionable steps you can take to overcome overthinking and start making those bold moves towards your goals.
Love it.
All right, we'll see you in the next part.
See you there.
Okay, so we've talked about how overthinking can really hold us back and how taking action can be like the key to moving forward.
Yeah.
So now let's get practical, right? Like, how do we actually do this?
Okay.
And Twisty actually offers some specific bets that we can make.
Right.
Now, they are tailored to their specific field, but I think they hold valuable lessons for all of us.
Absolutely.
So do you remember what those 3 suggestions were?
Yeah, so they suggested switching to a different bookkeeper, changing your EHR system, which is your electronic health record system,
Right.
and then investing in leadership and sales training.
Okay, so it's not just about like taking any action. It's about strategically choosing actions that support our goals.
Exactly.
Our growth.
And I think at the core of all 3 of those suggestions is this idea of investing in yourself.
Okay.
And the tools that can help you operate more effectively.
So like if overthinking comes from like fear and uncertainty, like investing in yourself can help build confidence and reduce those feelings.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Like if you feel more equipped to handle challenges, you're less likely to get bogged down in overanalyzing every little thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Twisty's suggestions, while specific to their field, I think they point to this broader principle of like identifying areas where we can make strategic investments to move forward.
Exactly. And it actually ties back to our discussion about adaptability.
Okay.
Because sometimes the best way to adapt is to like equip ourselves with new resources.
Right.
New knowledge.
Yeah.
So you're better prepared to face whatever comes your way.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is making me think about like my own overthinking traps, right? And I bet our listeners are doing the same. Like, what are some questions we can ask ourselves to identify those areas where we might be getting stuck?
That's a great question. I think one way to approach it is to think about recurring patterns in your life. Like, are there certain types of decisions that always seem to trigger that overthinking?
For me, it's anything related to like creative projects.
Oh, yeah.
Like I can spend hours, sometimes days, just like second guessing myself before I even start.
Oh, I feel that that's so common. You know, I think a lot of people experience that, especially with creative endeavors.
Yeah.
It's like this fear of putting yourself out there.
Right.
And that fear can really prevent us from pursuing things that we truly care about.
Yeah. So how do we break free from those patterns? Like once we've identified them?
Well, once you've identified a pattern, the next step is to really explore the underlying fears or beliefs that might be driving it.
So in my example, it might be like fear of failure, fear of judgment, or maybe even just like a belief that I'm not creative enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once you've kind of like identified those underlying beliefs, then you can start to challenge them.
Okay.
Like, are they really true? Or are they just limiting beliefs that you've picked up along the way?
Yeah. And this is where I think self-awareness is so important.
Yes, absolutely.
Like recognizing those beliefs and then working on replacing them with more empowering ones.
Exactly. Because it's not just about changing our behaviors. It's about shifting our underlying mindset.
Right. It's like rewiring our brains to think in a more positive and proactive way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we've identified our overthinking traps, explored the underlying beliefs, and started to challenge those beliefs. What's next? What do we do?
Well, this is where Twisty's emphasis on action comes back into play.
Okay.
It's time to experiment.
Okay, so experiment with what?
With different approaches to breaking free from those overthinking patterns. Because remember, there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
What works for one person might not work for another.
Okay, so it's about finding what resonates with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Individually.
It's almost like becoming a scientist of your own mind.
Okay.
You're observing your patterns, testing different strategies, and seeing what helps you move forward.
And this is where I think self-compassion also comes in, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're bound to like stumble and fall back into those old patterns sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not going to be perfect.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Like the key is to approach those setbacks with curiosity and kindness rather than judgment.
So instead of like beating ourselves up for like failing, we can view those moments as opportunities.
Exactly.
To learn and adjust our approach.
It's about reframing, right? Yeah. Can we shift our perspective from viewing these setbacks as failures to seeing them as valuable data points that can inform our future choices? And this goes back to something you mentioned earlier about the brain's adaptability.
Oh, yeah.
Like each time we encounter a challenge, our brain learns and grows from that experience.
Exactly.
Even if the outcome wasn't what we hoped for.
Yeah, it's about embracing the journey with all of its twists and turns and trusting that each experience, positive or negative, contributes to our overall growth.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So we've talked about identifying our overthinking traps, challenging those limiting beliefs.
Yeah.
Experimenting with different approaches,
right?
Practicing self-compassion.
Yeah.
What are some concrete strategies that our listeners can start implementing today to break free from that overthinking cycle?
Okay, so one strategy that I find really helpful is setting time limits for decision making.
Okay, so instead of agonizing over a decision for days or weeks, give yourself a specific time frame.
Yes.
To gather information, weigh your options, and make a choice.
Exactly, because that can be a really powerful way to break that habit of overanalyzing.
Right.
And it also creates a sense of momentum.
Right, yeah.
You're not just stuck in that loop anymore. You're actually moving forward.
It's about taking back control of our thought process, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and setting boundaries around how much mental energy we're willing to invest in any given decision.
Love that, yeah.
Another strategy that I found helpful is focusing on the next right step.
Okay.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by the entire mountain, you have to climb, break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
I love that. Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Right, exactly.
You just break it down into these smaller, more achievable actions.
Yeah, and that can help with the overthinking because it shifts our focus from the vast unknown to the immediate present.
Exactly, yeah.
So instead of getting lost in the what ifs and the should I or shouldn't?
We can ask ourselves, what's the next small step I can take to move forward?
And that shift in focus can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
Because it takes the pressure off of having to have everything figured out from the start.
Right.
You know?
It's about trusting that we'll figure things out as we go.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a much more empowering and sustainable approach.
Okay. I'm also thinking about mindfulness, right?
Oh, yes.
How can mindfulness help us break free from overthinking?
That's a fantastic point.
Yeah.
Because mindfulness practices like meditation or even just taking a few deep breaths can help us become more aware of our thought patterns and create space between our thoughts and our reactions.
So instead of getting swept away by that overthinking spiral, we can learn to observe those thoughts without judgment.
Yes.
And choose a more intentional response.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of detachment from our thoughts.
Right.
Recognizing that they're just mental events.
They're not necessarily truths or commands that we need to follow.
And this ties back to what we were talking about earlier with challenging those limiting beliefs.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, because by becoming more mindful of our thought patterns, we can identify and question those beliefs that are no longer serving us.
That's a great connection, yeah.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how all of these different strategies for overcoming overthinking, they all kind of work together to support that shift in mindset and behavior.
So it's not about finding that one magic bullet.
Right.
It's about creating this holistic approach.
Exactly.
That incorporates self-awareness, mindfulness, action, and a willingness to experiment and learn along the way.
Yes. And I think that's what's so empowering about Twisty's message, right?
Yeah.
It's not about providing a rigid set of rules. It's about encouraging us to become active participants in our own growth and development.
Yeah, it's about taking ownership of our thoughts, challenging those limiting beliefs, and creating a more intentional and fulfilling life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a message that resonates deeply with all of us.
I know, it definitely resonates with me, and this conversation has been incredibly insightful and inspiring.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
I'm feeling more motivated than ever to break free from my overthinking traps and just start taking those steps, know?
And I have no doubt that you'll achieve amazing things.
Oh, thanks.
Just remember, the world belongs to those who move.
Yes, exactly. And this has been such a valuable exploration of overthinking and action. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
And I'm excited to hear what our listeners take away from this conversation.
Me too. I'm sure they'll have some fantastic insights and strategies to share.
Yeah, before we wrap up this part,
Okay.
I just want to emphasize that, like, overcoming overthinking, it is a journey, not a destination.
Yes.
There are going to be ups and downs, setbacks, and breakthroughs along the way.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that progress, not perfection, is the goal.
Yeah.
Embrace the messy, iterative nature of this process and celebrate each step that you take towards a more intentional and fulfilling life.
Beautifully said.
Oh, thanks.
And with that, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But don't go anywhere, listeners, because in the final part, we'll be exploring some additional strategies for managing overthinking and taking action towards your goals. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into overthinking.
Yes.
And I'm excited to keep unpacking this idea of action as the antidote.
Yeah.
But before we get into the specific strategies, I've been thinking about something you mentioned earlier about the connection between overthinking and self-worth.
Okay.
It seems like there's this pressure to make the right decision all the time, which fuels the overthinking even more.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, there's definitely a tendency, especially in today's culture, to tie our self-worth to our successes and failures.
Right.
And when we do that, when we view our decisions as a reflection of our value, the stakes feel super high.
Right.
And that leads to more hesitation and overthinking.
It's like we're afraid to make a mistake because it might mean we're not good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough.
Exactly. And that fear can be so paralyzing,
Yeah.
But the thing is, our worthiness isn't contingent on making perfect decisions.
Yes.
We are worthy simply because we exist.
That is such a good reminder.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about self-compassion, especially when it comes to making decisions.
Oh, absolutely. We have to give ourselves permission to make mistakes.
Right.
To learn and grow from those experiences.
Yeah.
And to recognize that those missteps don't define us.
Yeah. Right. It's about separating our actions from our inherent worth.
Exactly.
We can strive to make the best decisions possible, but also recognize we're going to mess up sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
And that acceptance, that self-compassion can really free us up.
Yeah.
To take more risks, try new things.
Right.
And ultimately live a more fulfilling life.
Yeah. It's like that saying, done is better than perfect.
Yes.
Sometimes we just got to take action.
Yeah.
Even if it's messy or imperfect.
Exactly.
And trust that we can course correct along the way.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great segue into talking about some more specific strategies.
Yeah.
For managing this.
So what are some tools or techniques that our listeners can start using today?
Okay, one technique that I find really helpful is called thought challenging.
Okay.
And it's basically about recognizing those negative or anxious thoughts that pop up when you're making decisions.
Right.
And then questioning their validity.
Okay, so if I'm thinking I'm going to make the wrong decision.
Right.
I can stop and ask myself, is that really true? What evidence do I have?
Exactly. And oftentimes when we really examine those thoughts, we realize they're based on assumptions or fears, not facts.
Okay.
So by challenging those thoughts, you can start to create a more balanced and realistic perspective.
Okay, so it's about shifting our thinking from worst case scenario to what's actually likely to happen.
And this can also help us identify those limiting beliefs.
Oh, right. Okay.
That we talked about.
So if I notice that I keep thinking I'm not good enough to take on this challenge, I can start to explore where that belief came from.
Exactly.
And if it's still serving me.
Yeah, and by becoming more aware of those beliefs, we can consciously choose more empowering ones.
I like that. Another strategy that I've used is creating a worry journal.
Okay.
I know it sounds a little counterintuitive. Yeah. But it's basically dedicating a specific time and place to write down all your worries and anxieties.
Yeah, that could be really helpful for getting those thoughts out of your head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Onto paper.
Right.
So they're not swirling around up there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you can focus on other things.
And sometimes just the act of writing them down can help you gain some perspective.
Right.
You realize, oh, these aren't as scary as I thought they were.
Yeah. This whole conversation has been so empowering.
Oh, I'm glad.
Like, we've explored so many different strategies, from mindset shifts to practical techniques.
Yeah, and I think that's what's important to remember is that
Yeah.
there are so many tools out there.
Right.
And it's about finding what works best for you.
Yeah. And as Twisty reminds us, the world belongs to those who move.
Yes.
So let's take these insights, experiment with the strategies, and see what we can create when we, like, step out of our comfort zones. Yeah. And embrace the power of action.
I can't wait to see what our listeners accomplish.
Me too.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been so fun.
And until next time, keep thinking.
Keep learning.
Keep learning.
And keep making those bold moves.
Yes.